December 1943, the Italian mountains, 3 o'clock in the morning, and an American officer closes his eyes in horror while a Canadian Special Forces soldier slowly draws a knife behind the back of a captured German major. The order from headquarters was clear: take him alive, interrogate him, preserve him. The Americans wanted to talk. The Canadians wanted something else entirely. And you know what? They got exactly what they wanted. You think you know Canadians? Polite, sweet, apologizing for every little thing? Forget it. Today, I am going to tell you a story that Hollywood will never film, that Canadian textbooks bypass, and that veterans kept silent about until they reached their graves. The story of how the nice guys from the land of maple syrup turned into the most terrifying soldiers of World War II, so terrifying that the German command officially ordered its troops to surrender to the Americans, surrender to the British, but never, do you hear me? Never surrender to the Canadians. Why? What were they doing that made the SS prefer to fight to their last bullet rather than fall into their hands? And why did their American allies turn a blind eye to what happened after the battle? Today, you will learn everything: documents that were only declassified in the 90s, testimonies that were hidden for 50 years, and the final words of a Canadian sergeant written before he passed when a polite Canadian says sorry to you. Remember that his grandfather might have been destroying people with his bare hands. Watch until the end, and because what I'm about to tell you will change everything you thought you knew about the Second World War. Let's go. December 1943, in the Italian mountains near Monte la Defensa, 3 o'clock in the morning, an American Lieutenant James Connolly closes his eyes in horror while a Canadian sergeant slowly draws a knife behind the back of a captured German major. A few hours earlier, the U.S. Fifth Army headquarters had transmitted a clear order. This officer was to be taken alive, interrogated, and intelligence extracted regarding German fortifications in the Leary Valley. The order was received, confirmed, and recorded in the operational log. But the Canadians from the 1st Special Service Force, whom the Germans had already nicknamed the Black Devils, had their own understanding of military justice. And that understanding did not include mercy for a man who 3 days prior had ordered the execution of 12 Canadian scouts captured during a night raid. But the American lieutenant did not yet know the most terrifying part: what would happen in the next 5 minutes. This story never made it into official reports. The American command preferred to forget it, British historians bypassed it, and Canadian veterans spoke of it only in whispers, only among their own, and only after the 3rd glass of whiskey. But it is precisely such episodes that explain why, by the end of 1944, German soldiers on the Italian front had an unspoken order: surrender to the Americans, surrender to the British, but never, under any circumstances, surrender to the Canadians. And to understand how the polite boys from the land of maple syrup turned into the Wehrmacht's nightmare, we must go back 4 years. Canada in 1939 was 11 million people scattered across a territory larger than all of Western Europe. It was a land of lumberjacks, miners, hunters, and farmers who knew what 40-degree below zero frost felt like and knew how to survive in conditions where the nearest doctor was 100 kilometers away. When Prime Minister Mackenzie King announced entry into the war, he did not introduce conscription, unlike the Americans, who would later stamp out soldiers by the millions through the draft system. The Canadian Army was formed exclusively from volunteers, but this difference would become a death sentence for thousands of German soldiers. An American draftee of 1942 was a guy from Ohio or California who was pulled from college or a factory, dressed in a uniform, given a rifle, and sent to fight for a country that was not directly threatened by anything. The Pacific Ocean separated him from Japan, the Atlantic from Germany. The war was distant, abstract, almost unreal. A Canadian volunteer of 1939 was a man who came to the recruitment office himself, signed the papers himself, and chose this fate himself. He knew he was not going to a training exercise. He knew many of his comrades would not return, and he came anyway, because he wanted not just to fight, but to destroy. By 1942, when the Americans were just beginning to deploy their military machine, Canadian soldiers had already spent 3 years in trenches, in training, in constant anticipation. They went through the humiliation of Dunkirk, where Canadian units covered the British evacuation. They survived the Dieppe catastrophe in August 42, when out of nearly 5,000 Canadian soldiers who landed on the French shore, more than 900 were destroyed, and nearly 2,000 were taken prisoner. But Dieppe was not just a defeat. It became a point of no return. Many of those prisoners later died in German camps under unexplained circumstances. News leaked through the Red Cross, through rare letters, through escaped prisoners of war. Dieppe became a wound that would never heal in Canadian military memory, and this wound turned the polite boys from Toronto and Vancouver into something the Germans were completely unprepared for. What happened after Dieppe would change the rules of war on the Western Front forever. In Canadian units, a subtle but fundamental shift occurred. Soldiers stopped talking about quote 3. They started talking about quote 4. Officers stopped reminding men of the Geneva Convention. They began to turn a blind eye to what happened after capturing German positions. This was not official policy. Officially, Canada complied with all international norms of warfare. No, unofficially, at the level of platoons and companies, an unspoken code formed. The Germans would pay for every Canadian destroyed at Dieppe in full, with interest, and soon a unit would appear that would turn this code into an art form. The idea belonged to the British inventor and adventurer Geoffrey Pike, who in 1942 proposed creating an elite unit for sabotage operations in occupied Norway. The plan was ambitious to the point of madness: land several thousand hand-picked fighters trained in mountain and winter warfare, and create a guerrilla hell for the Germans in the Scandinavian mountains. The American command, charmed by the idea, created a new formation and began recruiting volunteers. But the Americans encountered a problem they didn't expect. Their recruits had no experience in extreme winter conditions. A solution was found quickly: bring in Canadians for whom -30 was a normal winter temperature. In July 1942, at Fort Harrison, Montana, the first Canadian volunteers arrived. American officers expected to see polite, disciplined allies who would follow orders and not cause trouble. What they got instead shocked them. Instead of obedient allies, they got a group of sullen, silent men, many of whom had already been in combat, many of whom had lost friends at Dieppe, and all of whom, without exception, looked at their American colleagues with thinly veiled contempt. The Canadians did not hide their attitude. Americans were rookies, green, untested boys who thought war was an adventure from a Hollywood movie, and the first weeks in camp proved the Canadians were not joking. The first weeks at Fort Harrison were marked by constant clashes. Canadians refused to follow orders they considered stupid. They started brawls in bars. They openly mocked American drill practice, which they considered meaningless parade ground marching. One incident became legend. A Canadian sergeant, a former lumberjack from British Columbia, publicly called an American hand-to-hand combat instructor a desk-bound theorist. What happened in the next 3 minutes sent the instructor to the infirmary for a week. The sergeant demonstrated how real combat differs from a textbook. The American received 3 broken ribs and a damaged jaw. But instead of court-martialing the Canadian, the American commanders did something unexpected. They realized they were not facing ordinary allies, but fighters of an entirely different caliber, and they made a radical decision to let the Canadians train the Americans. The result exceeded all expectations and created a monster that the Germans would call the Black Devils. By the end of 1942, the 1st Special Service Force had turned into something with no parallels in the Allied armies, and the fighters mastered 13 types of cold steel. They knew how to move silently over any terrain, from mountain slopes to urban ruins. They studied German weapons so well that they preferred captured submachine guns to their own rifles, and most importantly, they adopted a philosophy that would make Germans pray before going to sleep. This philosophy was simple: do not take prisoners if it creates a tactical risk. The Norwegian operation never took place, the strategic situation changed, and the plan was abandoned. No 1,500 trained cutthroats required deployment. In December 1943, the Devil's Brigade was sent to Italy, where the Allies were stuck in front of the German defensive Gustav Line, and the Canadians finally got the opportunity to show what they were capable of. Monte la Defensa is a mountain 950 meters high, controlling a key pass into the Liri Valley, and the Germans had turned it into an impregnable fortress. 3 American regiments had already tried to take this height, and 3 times they were repelled with heavy losses. The slopes were too steep for ordinary infantry. German machine gun nests raked every meter of the approaches. The 5th Army Command was ready to admit that Monte la Defensa was invincible. until someone remembered the Devil's Brigade. The plan was suicidal. Climb the sheer cliff on the northwest side where the Germans would not expect an attack because they considered the route physically impassable. Climb at night without artillery support in total silence, and strike the rear of the German positions before dawn, 600 fighters against a fortified garrison numbering about 250 men. But the Germans did not yet know what Canadian stubbornness was. On the 2nd of December 1943, at 0:30 hours, the first groups of the Devil's Brigade began the ascent. They carried weapons, ammunition, grenades. Each fighter lugged nearly 30 kilograms of gear up an almost vertical cliff in pitch darkness. The temperature was near zero, the rocks were covered with an ice crust, and any fall meant certain death. But the Canadian fighters climbed upward with the silent concentration of people who had come not to fight, but to take revenge. Many of them grew up in the mountains of British Columbia and Alberta. For them, this climb was difficult, but not impossible. The Germans discovered the attack too late. At 5:30 in the morning, the first fighters of the Devil's Brigade reached the German positions. What happened next, the German survivors would later describe as a slaughter in the darkness. And the word slaughter was no exaggeration. Canadians and Americans burst into the trenches with knives and bayonets. Firearms were used only as a last resort to avoid giving away positions. German soldiers woke up with their throats slit. Machine gun crews were destroyed by grenades tossed into embrasures. By sunrise, Monte la Defensa was in the hands of the Allies. But the real nightmare for the American command began after the battle. Among the prisoners was a German major from the division staff, a valuable source of intelligence. 5th Army Headquarters immediately issued an order: transport the officer to the rear for interrogation, treat him in accordance with the Geneva Convention, and provide medical assistance if necessary. The order was clear, unambiguous, coming from General Mark Clark personally. But the Canadians already knew who this major was and what he had done. 3 days earlier, this officer had commanded an operation against a Canadian reconnaissance patrol. 12 men, a sergeant, and 11 privates were captured after a failed sortie. According to the rules of war, they should have become prisoners of war. Instead, they were taken behind German positions and shot. The bodies were found the next morning, hands tied behind their backs, shots to the back of the head. Among those shot was the younger brother of one of the Canadian sergeants participating in the assault. The American lieutenant who was tasked with escorting the captured major would later tell this story only once, to his son a few months before his own death in 1987. According to him, the Canadian sergeant, the one whose brother was among those shot, approached him and very calmly explained the situation. The lieutenant remembered his words for the rest of his life. The American could take the major and try to deliver him to the rear. But to do that, he would have to pass through 20 Canadian fighters who knew what this German had done, and not one of those 20 intended to step aside. The lieutenant tried to appeal to orders, to discipline, to international law. The Canadian listened and answered with a phrase that explains everything. "We didn't come here to follow rules. We came here to end wars. You Americans have your war, clean by the book, with prisoners and tribunals. We have ours. And in our war, this man is already condemned." What happened next, the lieutenant never described in detail. He said only that he closed his eyes and stepped aside. When he opened his eyes a few minutes later, the major was no longer there. The official report stated that the German officer died while attempting to escape. No investigation followed. The Canadian fighters returned to the ranks. The war continued. But this episode was only the first drop in a sea of blood that the Canadians would spill before the end of the war. And by the spring of '44, the Devil's Brigade would earn a reputation that would precede them on any sector of the front. German soldiers found strange black cards on the bodies of their comrades with the inscription, quote, 10, quote, 11. This was psychological terror in its purest form. Canadians and Americans from the special unit intentionally left these business cards after night raids, creating an atmosphere of paranoia in German units. The effect exceeded all expectations. Germans began to be afraid of falling asleep. Wehrmacht soldiers posted double and triple guards. They shot at shadows and at each other in panic. The morale of the German divisions opposing the Devil's Brigade steadily declined. German military intelligence, the Abwehr, began gathering a dossier on the strange unit. The reports were riddled with panicked phrasing. What they wrote became the official recognition of Canadian superiority. The enemy uses methods incompatible with the traditions of European warfare. Night attacks without warning, mass use of cold steel, systematic refusal to take prisoners. It is necessary to warn personnel. Upon contact with the Black Devils, fight to the end. Surrendering as a prisoner does not guarantee survival. This last point was key. The German command officially recognized what the American and British headquarters preferred to ignore. Canadian soldiers did not play by the rules, and the question, why, required an answer that no one wanted to give out loud. What turned the polite boys from the land of maple syrup and hockey into the most terrifying fighters on the European front? The answer lies in the psychology of the volunteer, and it is frightening in its simplicity. An American draftee fought because he had to. A Canadian volunteer fought because he wanted to. He was told to show up at the recruitment office, and he showed up. He was told to shoot Germans, and he shot them, but deep down, many American soldiers perceived the war as an unpleasant duty that needed to be survived so they could return home. They didn't want to become heroes, they wanted to survive. A Canadian volunteer could not afford such a luxury. He chose the war. And this choice required justification. If he had already decided to risk his life of his own free will, he had to do it with maximum efficiency. Half measures were psychologically unacceptable. A volunteer could not afford the luxury of doubt. He had to believe his choice was right, that his methods were justified, that his sacrifice had meaning. Furthermore, the Canadians carried the burden of national humiliation. Dieppe was a disaster that no one could forget, and no one intended to forgive. Nearly 1,000 dead, 2,000 prisoners. For a country with a population of 11 million, these were monstrous losses. Every Canadian soldier knew someone who had died or been captured at Dieppe. Many lost brothers, fathers, best friends, and they knew how the Dieppe prisoners were treated in German camps. All this created a special kind of hatred. Cold, calculating, patient. The Canadians didn't scream or threaten, they simply did their job with the methodicalness of butchers at a slaughterhouse. And this methodicalness frightened the Germans far more than any hysteria. No, the Italian campaign was only a warm-up. The real horror awaited the Germans in Normandy, and there the Canadians would show that their capacity for brutality had no limits. On the 6th of June, 1944, D-Day, Canadian troops landed at the Juno sector, one of the 5 Normandy beaches. It was the largest Canadian military operation in history, nearly 15,000 men in the first wave, with tens of thousands more in subsequent echelons. They went to take revenge for Dieppe, and they got their chance, and sooner than they expected. Losses during the landing were heavy, 340 dead, and more than 1,000 wounded on the first day. But the Canadians achieved a result that the Americans did not achieve at neighboring Omaha. They broke through the coastal defenses and by the evening of the first day had advanced 10 kilometers deep into France, further than any other Allied group. While the Americans were choking in blood at Omaha, the Canadians were already 10 kilometers from the shore, and here they encountered an enemy that matched their reputation, the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend. This was a unit formed from young fanatics raised in Hitlerite ideology from childhood. The average age of the soldiers was 18 years. They were trained, ideologically motivated, and absolutely ruthless. What the SS men would do in the following days would change the character of the war on the Western Front forever. On the 7th of June, the day after the landing, the SS men captured a group of Canadian prisoners of war, more than 20 men from a reconnaissance unit. The prisoners were taken to the village of Ardennes Abbey, where the German command post was located. There they were shot, one by one over the course of several hours. Some were interrogated and beaten first, some were shot immediately. The bodies were found by Canadian troops a few days later, and what they saw broke the final barriers. Hands tied, shots to the head, signs of torture. This was not the only crime. Over the next week, the SS from Hitlerjugend destroyed about 100 more Canadian prisoners in various locations. Some were shot at the place of capture, some were killed after interrogations, some were simply stabbed with knives. The SS considered this an economy of ammunition. When news of the executions reached Canadian units, a momentary and fundamental shift occurred. Officers who had previously insisted on compliance with the Geneva Convention suddenly stopped reminding men about the rules for treating prisoners. Soldiers who previously took prisoners stopped doing so. An unwritten order spread throughout the Canadian group with the speed of a forest fire. Do not take SS men prisoner under any circumstances for any reason. But this proved insufficient. The Canadians went further. In mid-June, Canadian units received reinforcements from veterans of the Italian campaign, hardened fighters who already had experience with the special treatment of Germans. These veterans brought with them not only combat skills, but also a philosophy, the philosophy of total war, in which mercy exists for no one, and this philosophy spread quickly among the newcomers, like a plague. By the end of June 1944, the Canadian grouping in Normandy had turned into something the Germans did not expect to meet on the Western Front, an organized machine of destruction that acted by its own rules, ignoring international conventions and the orders of the Allied command. This was no secret. German military intelligence regularly recorded reports of Canadian brutality. American and British officers began sending reports expressing concern about the methods of their Canadian colleagues. Even in London and Washington, questions began to be asked. Was the Canadian Army going beyond the permissible? But no one did anything. The reason was pragmatic and cynical. The Canadians showed results. They broke through German defenses where others got stuck. They held positions that others lost, and the price of this efficiency seemed entirely acceptable to the Allied command. July 1944 brought a new bloody episode, Operation Atlantic, the offensive on the city of Caen, a key transport hub in the Normandy interior. The Germans defended Caen with the desperation of the doomed. They understood that the fall of the city would open the way into France for the Allies. Several SS Panzer divisions were concentrated in and around the city, including the remnants of Hitlerjugend, the very same killers who had shot Canadian prisoners in June. The Canadians knew who they were dealing with, and they didn't come to fight, they came to destroy. The battles for Caen lasted nearly a month, from the 8th of July to the 18th of August. It was a continuous nightmare. Tank attacks, artillery shelling, street fighting, hand-to-hand combat in the ruins. Canadian losses were enormous, but German losses were incomparably higher. More than 1,000 Canadians died, several thousand were wounded, and the main difference was in the character of the losses. American and British units operating in adjacent sectors captured thousands of German prisoners. Canadian units participating in the same battles had almost no prisoners. The statistics were telling and frightening. Under comparable combat conditions and roughly equal forces, the ratio of prisoners to destroyed for the Americans was approximately 3 to 1, for the British about 2 to 1, for the Canadians less than 1 to 10. One British colonel, commanding an adjacent sector, would write words in his diary that would be classified for half a century. Quote, 23, quote, 24, quote, 25. This diary was published only in 1991 after the author's passing, and it caused a scandal in military historical circles. Canadian historians declared it biased and not corresponding to reality, but German documents declassified in the same year confirmed every word. The episode in the village of Verrières became especially horrific. On the 25th of July, the Canadian South Saskatchewan Regiment attacked German positions on a ridge controlling the approaches to the village. The Germans, units of the 1st SS Panzer Division, Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, offered fierce resistance. The battle lasted 16 hours. The Canadians lost more than 200 men, catastrophic losses for a single regiment in one day. But when the smoke cleared, the second act of the tragedy began. Wounded Germans were on the positions, those who could not retreat and could not continue the fight. By all rules of war, they should have received medical aid and the status of prisoners of war. Instead, the Canadian soldiers, who had lost half of their comrades over the preceding hours, walked through the trenches with the methodicalness of butchers. Not a single wounded German survived this clearing, An American medic attached to the Canadian headquarters later gave testimony to an investigative commission. I offered my help to treat the enemy's wounded. I was told there were no wounded. When I insisted and went to inspect the positions myself, I don't want to describe what I found. I will only say that some of these people clearly did not receive their wounds in battle. The testimony was classified for 50 years, and when it was declassified, the Canadian government refused to comment. By August 1944, the Canadian Army had advanced to the Falaise Pocket, a massive encirclement in which the remnants of German forces in Normandy found themselves. About 100,000 German soldiers were trapped in a narrowing ring. Under continuous bombardment and artillery fire, thousands tried to surrender, and on the path of many of them stood Canadian units. The Falaise Pocket became one of the most terrifying meat grinders of the Second World War on the Western Front. Official figures speak of 10,000 German dead and 50,000 prisoners. But these figures hide an important detail. The majority of the prisoners were captured by American and British units on the southern and northern faces of the pocket. On the eastern face, where the Canadians operated, the statistics were completely different. Canadian units closing the exit from the pocket captured fewer than 5,000 prisoners. At the same time, German losses in their sector were estimated at more than 20,000 people. The mathematics were simple and terrifying. 4 out of 5 Germans who tried to break through the Canadian positions did not live to see captivity. General Omar Bradley would later write a phrase that became an epitaph for tens of thousands of Germans. The Falaise Pocket was closed by the Canadians and the Poles. Both nations had special scores to settle with the Germans. The Poles for 1939, the Canadians for Dieppe, and the executed prisoners. I will not comment on the methods they used. I will only say that General Montgomery had no complaints about the results. Had no complaints about the results. This phrase meant the silent approval of everything that occurred. After Normandy, the Canadian Army rushed to the northeast, toward Belgium, Holland, and ultimately to Germany itself. And with every kilometer, their reputation grew with new stories, new rumors, and new horrors. In the autumn of 1944, the Canadians were liberating the mouth of the Scheldt River. These would be some of the hardest battles in Canadian history and some of the bloodiest. Without Antwerp, the Allies could not supply their advancing armies, and the Germans understood this and defended the estuary with the desperation of the doomed. The terrain, low-lying polders flooded by the Germans, was ideal for defense and a nightmare for an offensive. The Canadians had to attack along narrow dikes where maneuver was impossible. A single machine gun crew could stop an entire battalion, and the Germans took advantage of this. Losses were catastrophic. More than 12,000 men in a month of fighting, including nearly 3,000 dead. This was more than the Canadians lost during the Normandy landing. And these losses fueled the hatred that was already heated to the limit. By this point, the Canadian Army no longer made distinctions between the Wehrmacht and the SS. For soldiers who had lost half their comrades in the flooded polders, all Germans were the same, enemies who deserved one fate, and the Canadians carried out this fate with a methodicalness that frightened even their allies. One American war correspondent attached to Canadian units would later refuse to publish his notes. Many years later, he would explain why, and then his words were shocking. I saw things that were impossible to print in any American newspaper, not because they were shocking, war is always shocking, but because they showed our allies in a light that no one wanted to see. The Canadians fought like demons. They were incredibly effective. No, their effectiveness had a price that we preferred not to talk about. By the winter of '44, Canadian units crossed the Dutch border and reached the Rhine. Ahead lay Germany, the enemy land that the Canadians had dreamed of trampling since 1939, and there, their methods honed in Italy, Normandy, and Holland would reach their peak. But that is a story for a separate account, the story of the invasion into the heart of the Reich. And now let us return to where we began. A December night in the Italian mountains, an American lieutenant with closed eyes, a Canadian sergeant with a knife, a German major who already knows that the order for mercy will not reach him. Was the sergeant a villain, or was he a victim of circumstances, a man whom war had turned into an instrument of revenge? These questions have no right answers, but they explain everything. War is a territory where moral compasses break and ethical principles dissolve in blood and fear. The people who have been there know this better than anyone, and that is exactly why many of them preferred to remain silent. The Canadian Army of the Second World War was one of the most effective fighting forces of the Allies. No, effectiveness had a price, and that price was humanity. In 1945, the war ended. Canadian soldiers returned home, received medals, got jobs, and started families. Many never spoke of what they had seen and done. Some drank, trying to forget. Some woke up in a cold sweat until the end of their days. And some wrote memoirs that read like a confession. One such memoir, written by a Canadian sergeant from the Devil's Brigade and published posthumously in 1992, ends with words worth quoting. "I did things I cannot tell even to a priest. I did them because it was war and because they did the same. I do not ask for forgiveness. I'm not sure I deserve it. But I want people to know when a polite Canadian says sorry to you, remember that his grandfather might have been destroying people with his bare hands. We are not the way you see us. We never were." This is perhaps the most honest epitaph for the Canadian Army of the Second World War, an army that taught the world to fear the word sorry. That German major in the Italian mountains never found out why the Canadians ignored the order to spare him. He never found out about the executed scouts, about the sergeant who lost his brother, about the years of accumulated hatred that sought an outlet. For him, the final minutes of life were an incomprehensible nightmare. The Americans tried to protect him, the Canadians stood in a silent circle, and one of them slowly, almost ceremoniously, drew a knife. The Americans wanted to talk, to interrogate, to find out, to bargain for information. The Canadians wanted something else, and in December 1943, in the cold mountains of Italy, the Canadians got what they wanted. This is the truth about the Second World War that Hollywood does not make movies about. This is the story that Canadian textbooks prefer to bypass. This is the memory that veterans carried with them to their graves. But it happened. It really happened. And now you know it.